Hello students. So this is the 14th lecture which refers to offer curves in economics. So we'll try to understand what is offer curves, how they are derived and elasticity of offer curves. Now introducing offer curves, we need to know what these actually are. International trade between countries, whether developed or developing or underdeveloped, is favorable for economic development of trading countries in particular and the world in general. The country under autarky or no trade, which means a closed economy, can never prosper economically. Trading countries ultimately can reap the fruits of gain or profit. However, the distribution of gains may vary between countries. Large countries or the countries having comparative advantage in production of any commodity, especially manufactured commodities, may gain more compared to the countries producing primary commodities. In other words, gains from trade may be inequitable, but economists are of the view that some trade is always better than no trade. Thus, there are various approaches towards analysis of gains from trade, some of which are briefly discussed in the next lecture. Coming to gains from trade, these have been analyzed using the concepts of comparative advantage, offer curves, production possibility curve, and community indifferent curves, and so on. So, gains from trade were measured by classical economists in terms of increase in national income, difference in comparative cost, terms of trade, etc. The modern economists explain gains from trade as composition of gains from exchange and gains from specialization. But the basic proposition is that trade leads to gain in welfare between the trading countries. Now coming to the definition of offer curves, these are critical concepts in international trade theory which illustrates how a country responds to the changes in relative prices of goods by offering certain quantities of one good in exchange for another. These curves represent the quantities of exports a country is willing to trade for various amounts of imports depending on the terms of trade. Thus, offer curve of a nation, which is also called the reciprocal demand curve, shows at each relative price the quantity supplied of exports and the quantity demanded for imports. Now the main key points: offer curve integrates a country's production possibility curve and indifferent curves. It also reflects the equilibrium between a country's supply and demand for goods in international markets. It also helps to determine the equilibrium terms of trade in a two-country, two-commodity framework. Now, how are these offer curves derived? So we know offer curves or trade offer curves show the quantities of any commodity one country is willing to offer in exchange of certain quantities of another commodity produced in a second country at a relative price. So basically what one country can offer another. Offer curve. The concept of offer curve was first put forward by Marshall and Edgeworth. However, later, Mill's idea of reciprocal demand is important to construct offer curves. So let us take the example of a diagram. Let there be two countries A and B, two commodities X and Y, which are produced. The exportable commodity of country A is X, that is commodity X is importable of country B. And similarly, the exportable commodity of country B is Y, that is commodity Y is importable of country A. Let us now assume that the price of commodity X increases relative to the price of Y under constant cost condition. In this context, let us derive the offer curve of country A using the following diagram. So the derivation of offer curves involves the following steps. First, we have to draw the PPF, the production possibility frontier, which shows the combination of two goods that a country can produce using all its resources efficiently. So a country A can produce either XX or YY or some combination of both. Secondly, indifferent curves and community preferences. Indifferent curves represent the community's preferences and consumption patterns. Also, the slope of an indifference curve, which is marginal rate of substitution, indicates how much of one good a country is willing to trade for another. We also need to know about relative prices and terms of trade, TOT. So, terms of trade refer to the relative price of exports in terms of imports, and as TOT improves for a country, it might export more of its good while demanding more imports. Next comes equilibrium trade point. So by combining the PPF and the indifferent curves, equilibrium trade points are identified for different TOTs. These points show how quantities of exports and imports maximize utility. Now we come to the plotting of the offer curve. The export quantity of one good is plotted on the x-axis and the import quantity of the good is plotted on the y-axis. We connect the equilibrium trade points for different terms of trade, which yields the offer curve. In the diagram, figure 5.1, the offer curve for country A is given in this diagram. Here, commodity is plotted along the horizontal axis and commodity Y along the vertical axis. Now, if a country uses all its available resources for producing commodity X, the maximum quantity of X that can be produced is OX naught. The initial price ratio line for the two commodities is OP1. The price ratio line becomes steeper with the rise in relative price ratio of commodity X to commodity Y. Thus, there is a gradually changed price ratio lines which is shown by OP2, OP3, OP4 in the diagram. Now, if the price ratio line is OP0, country A will not trade as it represents a very low price of commodity X in terms of commodity Y. The points of exchanges are E1, E2, E3 and E4. Thus, as stated above, the maximum quantity of commodity X that is produced in a country using all the resources of OX0 is shown in the diagram. Now, if the price ratio line is OP1, country A keeps X1, X0 quantity of commodity X for consumption by home people, and remaining OX1 will be exchanged with E1, X1 units of commodity Y at point E1. Similarly, at points of exchange E2, E3, E4, the units exchanged between countries A and B respectively are OX2 of X and E2X2 of Y, OX3 of X and E3X3 of Y, and OX4 of commodity X and E4X4 of commodity Y. In other words, country A exports OX1 units of commodity X in exchange of E1, X1 units of commodity Y from country B, where I is 1, 2, 3 and 4. Thus, the offer curve OFA, also known as the reciprocal demand curve as mentioned earlier, of country A can be traced out by joining the points E1, E2, E3 and E4 that gives the demand of a country A for commodity Y. In the same way, offer curve of country B can be constructed, and in the diagram, commodity X or country B's importable commodities plotted along the horizontal axis and commodity Y of country B's exportable commodities plotted along the vertical axis. So, figure 5.2 shows the offer curve for country B. Now, the steepness of the price ratio line decreases when the price of commodity Y increases relative to that of commodity X. In the same way, the logic explained above for country A, the offer curve for country B, OFB for country B can be derived. Now coming to equilibrium terms of trade. The equilibrium terms of trade is determined when the export of one country is equal to the imports of another country for different commodities. Graphically, this equilibrium point is determined at the intersection point of offer curves of two trading countries. As shown in figure 5.3, the equilibrium terms of trade, the diagram shows that the offer curve of country A, OFA, intersects the offer curve of country B, OFB, at point E. The equilibrium terms of trade is indicated by the slope of OE, and it may be noted that the export of commodity X by country A is equal to the import of commodity X by country B, which is equal to OX star. Similarly, the import of commodity Y by country A is equal to the export of commodity Y by country B equal to OY star. Therefore, there is equilibrium in both exports and imports. Now we come to the next subtopic, elasticity of offer curve. We shall try to discuss how such elasticity of offer curves are measured. So, coming to the measurement, country A is the exporter of commodity X and importer of commodity Y. If the quantity of X is exported shown by quantity X and quantity of Y imported is y, then elasticity of offer curve may be expressed as the following equation: E equal to proportionate change of imports divided by proportionate change of exports, which is dy by dx into x by y. Let us now consider the following diagram, where export of commodity X by country A is plotted along the horizontal axis and import of commodity Y by country B is plotted along the vertical axis. Thus, the elasticity of offer curve is shown in diagram 5.4. OFA is the offer curve for country A. Let E1 be any point on the offer curve in the upward rising positively sloped path. Let DE1 be a tangent to the offer curve at point x1. Here at point E1 quantity of X is OX1, Y is E1X1. Therefore, the above formula elasticity of offer curve is given as follows. Now the elasticity of offer curve is greater than unity. Similarly, at point E2, since the slope of the offer curve is infinity and the tangent is parallel to the vertical axis, the elasticity also tends to infinity. At point E3, elasticity of offer curve is negative. Now we come to the last subtopic, how distribution of gains from trade are done in terms of offer curves. We will do what is distribution of gains from trade in details in the next lecture, but just giving you a brief idea how these are indicated in offer curves. J.S. Mill, in terms of his reciprocal demand theory, has explained how trade takes place between countries and how gains from trade are distributed. According to him, reciprocal demand determines terms of trade. This terms of trade, or TOT, determines each trading country's distribution of gains from trade. Now, what is terms of trade? TOT is defined as the ratio of quantity of imports for a given quantity of exports of a country. David Ricardo explained the concept of cost difference but could not explain terms of trade. Mill proposed his theory based on the foundations laid down by Ricardo. Now, given the cost difference, the demand for commodities in both the countries determines TOT. We shall try to understand how TOT determines gains from trade for both countries. So, let there be two countries, country A and country B, and two commodities which are produced, X and Y. Let 1 unit of labor in country A produce 20 units of commodity X or 10 units of commodity Y. Again, 1 unit of labor in country B can produce 8 units of commodity X or 16 units of commodity Y. Therefore, the domestic terms of trade exchange ratio is X is to Y is 2 is to 1, where X and Y are quantities of commodities. 1 of unit X will therefore be exchanged for half units of Y in country A. Similarly, 1 unit of commodity X in country B will be exchanged for 2 units of Y, that is Y is to X equal to 1 is to 2. Now, John Stuart Mill proposed that reciprocal demand will determine actual exchange ratio of commodities X and Y. It is the relative strength and demand elasticity of each country engaged in trade for each other's product in terms of those countries' own product. If country A's demand for commodity Y is less elastic or inelastic, then the TOT will be closer to domestic price ratio. That is, X is to Y is 2 is to 1 or Y is to X equal to 1 is to 2. Will favor country B and disfavor country A. Country B will gain more compared to country A, and conversely, if country A's demand for commodity Y is more elastic, the country B's demand for commodity X is less elastic or inelastic. In terms of trade, which will be close to domestic exchange ratio, X is to Y equal to 1 is to 2. Now, country A will get more in terms of trade, favoring gains compared to country B. That is, TOT will disfavor country B and gain will be less compared to that of country B. Thus, we have seen how offer curves can be constructed for trading countries. Finally, elasticity of offer curve measures the responsiveness of a country's trade quantities to changes in terms of trade. We have already understood the formula. Coming to the types of elasticities, there can be an elastic offer curve, which means a small improvement in terms of trade results in a large increase in export quantities. We have inelastic offer curve, which means a large change in terms of trade results in a smaller change in export quantities. And we have unit elasticity, which means proportional changes in terms of trade and export quantities. Now let us try to understand what are the factors that influence the elasticity of such curves. Firstly, it is availability of substitutes for traded goods. Second, the relative importance of goods in production and consumption. And third, the structure of production cost and specialization. We also have graphical representation of the curves. It can be upward sloping curve, which reflects a country that exports more as the terms of trade improve. We have a backward bending curve, which means at higher terms of trade, a country might reduce exports to consume more domestically. Now, where are these curves actually applied? So basically the key applications. First is trade negotiation. It helps to understand the trade-offs between exports and import quantities for various terms of trade. Second, analysis of trade equilibrium. So the intersection of two countries' offer curves determines the equilibrium terms of trade and quantities traded. Third, impact of economic policies. Tariffs or subsidies alter the shape of countries' offer curve and affect international trade flows. Finally, we know that offer curves are a fundamental tool in understanding international trade economics, and by visualizing a country's willingness to trade under various terms, economists can analyze trade patterns, effects of policy changes, and the global allocation of resources. We shall try to understand the distribution from gains from trade in the next lecture, 15. Thank you so much.